Okay, guys, this is the next set of notes for your packet. We're starting on habitat and niche. So, a habitat, you'll notice, is up here in this top corner. A species habitat is a location where that species lives in its ecosystem. The habitat includes the places where it finds food, protection, and mates. So the habitat is the area where, within an ecosystem, where it finds the food that it needs, the protection it needs, and the mates in order to breed. Habitats and ecosystems have important characteristics called factors. We know that the abiotic factors are non-living, and the biotic factors are the living factors. Some organisms have very specific conditions that they must live in, and some organisms can tolerate a wider variety. That's saying, like, there are certain frogs that can live in habitats that are more salty, so estuaries where the fresh and salt water come together. So there's a wider variety where they can live, but some organisms are very, very specific and have to be in exactly the perfect condition to live. So that's what we consider a habitat. So what then is a niche? A niche is the role that a species plays, so the role the species plays in its ecosystem. A niche can often be confused with a habitat because when you think niche, you think the place, but it's not so much a place. The habitat is a location, but the niche is not really a location. So a habitat is a location and a set of conditions the organism lives under. The niche, however, describes how that organism has adapted to its environment and what it actually does in its environment. Two animals can live in the same habitat or the environmental location, but they cannot have the exact same niche or role in that ecosystem. So then there's something called the competitive exclusion principle. Scientists have found that species that coexist in an ecosystem community must have different niches. Two species that compete for exactly the same resources cannot coexist. It is thought that through competition, one species out of the two completely competing species eventually outcompetes the other. For example, in the coral reef ecosystem, no two fish species can compete entirely for the same resources. They may both eat zooplankton, but they may have different nesting sites. So let me move this down. Nesting sites. If they competed for everything, eventually one species would outcompete the other. Okay, so that's the difference between a habitat and a niche, and the fact that there's a competitive exclusion principle that states that two species are not going to coexist in the same area with if they are doing the same exact niches. If they have the same niche, one is going to outcompete the other. Okay, flip the page. On the back, we have something called a keystone species. So the keystone species, in an ecosystem, some niches are more crucial than others. Sometimes there is one particular species that helps maintain the stability in the ecosystem. That species is called a keystone species. The keystone species has a large effect with fewer numbers than you would expect for a species that makes such a big difference. So it doesn't necessarily have to have a very large population, but it has a very large role within that ecosystem. Often the keystone species is a predator that preys on primary consumers. Those are the herbivores, remember? That if not kept in check, would destroy the producers in the community. So it's like that video that you guys watched about the wolves. The deer in that area were decimating the riverbed area, to the sides of the river with all the vegetation. They were eating it completely gone, just decimating that area. And when they brought the wolves back, that would then control that population. It was amazing to see the vegetation that came back. If you want, go back and watch that video again and just think about it from the perspective of a keystone species. That those wolves were really the keystone species in that ecosystem. And so, if the keystone predator is removed, it can lead to an event called a top-down trophic cascade, which they mentioned in that video. Trophic cascade. The primary consumers can devastate the producers and then run out of food. Other organisms that depend on producers for nesting sites would also be affected and may also die. The land geography can change when plant life is no longer providing shade or roots to prevent soil erosion. So I really do encourage you to go back and watch that video from the perspective of thinking of those wolves as the keystone species and how that trophic cascade happened. So another example of this is the sea otter. The sea otter are a keystone species because without them, the kelp, which are the producers, in the kelp forest ecosystem would be destroyed by sea urchins, which are the primary consumers. So you have these sea otters, and the sea otters are the keystone species. They control the population of sea urchins, and by controlling that population, the kelp is able to grow appropriately. Sea otters prey on the sea urchins and keep them in check. The kelp forests are important because they protect the coastlines from storm surges. They also are important oxygen producers for our atmosphere, and they also provide nesting and breeding sites for many fish species. So this is a picture of the kelp here. This is the otter swimming, and we're seeing the sea urchins that exist, and those otters eat the sea urchins and keep that in check so the kelp can continue to grow. But if the otters weren't there, then the sea urchins would take over these kelp forests and ultimately change that ecosystem. Okay, next page. We have another term called umbrella species. So an umbrella species can also be keystone species with a wide geographic range. Umbrella species need large habitat ranges. They often migrate and prey on organisms in several areas. The Siberian tiger is an endangered umbrella species that preys on deer, boar, and moose in a large range called the umbrella range of the Siberian tiger. So we're talking about the fact that the Siberian tiger does not stay in one small location. It has quite a large habitat range, and so therefore it's considered an umbrella species. That can also be a keystone species, and it helps to prey on lots of these primary consumers. Okay, then you have something called a foundation species. Foundation species have a unique role in actually creating and maintaining the ecosystem. Hence foundation species. Corals are an example. Corals could be called autogenic engineers. They change their environment by just growing and living in it. Oh, I must have read the wrong part. How did I get there? Oh, just kidding. I jumped down too far. Okay, foundation species have a unique role in the ecosystem. Corals are an example of a foundation species. They are made of tiny animals called polyps that grow together in colonies of millions. They are the foundation for the coral reef ecosystem that is home to hundreds of different fish species. Marine reptiles, and mammals and invertebrates. Okay, so then you have something called an ecosystem engineer. Like foundation species, ecosystem engineers change the geography of their habitat. They actually create, modify, and maintain, their environments. They change the biotic and abiotic factors, remember living and non-living, in their environment. Corals could be called autogenic engineers. They change their environment by just growing and living in it. Beavers are examples of allogenic engineers. We have auto and allo here. They change their environment by cutting down older trees, which allows new young trees to grow. They also build dams, which can dramatically change the meadows and streams around where they live, and they create new wetland habitats. Another type of species, a bioindicator or sentinel species. A bioindicator species is an organism that is really sensitive to environmental changes. Like water pollution and air pollution. So scientists can monitor these species for warning signs of of how pollution is changing the environment. You may remember that when we were on the boat and we were looking at the zooplankton and phytoplankton, we were looking to some degree at some of these bioindicators that they said that that's how they can tell how the lake is doing by the presence of those species. So frogs and toads, however, are a large example and often are used as bioindicator species because they have thin, absorbent skin that can easily absorb toxic chemicals in the environment. Tadpoles also absorb toxins or chemical pollutants through their gills. And scientists can monitor frog population size and health as a way to monitor the ecosystem's overall health. Hey, sorry I'm recording a video. So lastly, this is our last page, we have a term called carrying capacity. The carrying capacity of a species in a particular environment is the maximum population size that the environment can sustain. So the example of this would be the maximum number of grazing animals that can live in a meadow without destroying it. The carrying capacity can change if the abiotic and biotic factors change. For example, if the water supply, which is an abiotic factor, to a meadow is reduced, the amount of green plants that can grow to sustain the grazing primary consumers is also reduced. And the carrying capacity for the grazing organisms will be reduced. So now let's look at this graph here. We can see several things. Notice that on our x-axis we have time, how many years out, and up along the y-axis we have the population size, or the number of organisms that can, excuse me, that are living there. This dotted line is the actual carrying capacity, the amount that can be held. So as you see the population grow up, you'll notice that it starts to come down because it's above the carrying capacity and it can't sustain that for very long. Then it dips below the carrying capacity, and so then the population can grow, and then it goes slightly up and then comes down. And notice how it hovers right along this carrying capacity line. This is the level at which it makes sense for that number of population to exist there. Now, the water supply drops and therefore causes the carrying capacity to drop much lower. So that population dies off down to more of that level of carrying capacity. So that's what we're seeing here in that graph. We'll talk about some abiotic factors and biotic factors quickly. So examples of abiotic factors in terrestrial ecosystems include temperature range, soil composition, amount of light, rainfall, and water supply. Examples of abiotic factors in aquatic ecosystems would be dissolved oxygen, which remember you guys measured in our boat lab, and other dissolved ions. Temperature range, and sunlight amount, which we also measured that in our boat lab. And then biotic factors include food availability, so that's what they eat, the presence or absence of predators, and the presence or absence of competitors. So those are abiotic and biotic factors. So the biotic factors are the living ones because the food is living. They either eat plants or animals, the presence of predators, and the presence of competitors. So those are your notes for today, and we will do more tomorrow in class. I hope you have a good rest of your day.